Welcome to this webinar on the carbon markets under the Paris Agreement and its implementation at the national level. I'm very excited today to be having this webinar, which will be taking place in a dialogue-based format and will explore considerations that are relevant to how countries might implement carbon markets under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement and more generally. And to do that, we have four excellent speakers. Emily Gerard is a director and principal lawyer at Comhar Group Limited. It's an Australian-based legal and policy advisory firm. She's a climate change specialist with extensive experience in mitigation and adaptation matters, climate finance, renewable energy, carbon trading governance frameworks, and related policy. She works with national and subnational governments, multinational corporations, land managers, civil society bodies, and indigenous peoples. We have Carol Del Prolo, a Brazilian lawyer who specializes in climate change law and carbon markets. She has over 15 years of experience in law firm services in Brazil, and she has been a legal advisor to the group of least developed countries in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change negotiations since 2013. For the last 5 years, she has focused on Article 6 of the Paris Agreement in that work. She's a co-founder of the first network of climate change lawyers in Latin America. This network is called La Clima. We have Lydia Omuko-Young, who is an attorney based in Germany, who works as a senior legal consultant at Climate Focus. As part of her work, she advises governments on regulatory frameworks and policies on carbon markets, and she supports governments to develop carbon market frameworks. She also advises both private and public entities on carbon transactions, including negotiating and drafting contracts and conducting due diligence. We also have Anna Hickey, a partner in the climate finance practice of Philip Lee, a law firm based in Ireland. Philip Lee was awarded Best Law Firm in the Voluntary Carbon Market 2023 by the journal Environmental Finance. This webinar will be divided in 4 parts. The first part is going to be a general overview and background to carbon markets and some of the main drivers for investment. And then following that, we will delve into very briefly some of the key elements of the cooperative approaches that Article 6 of the Paris Agreement sets out, with then the third part looking at considerations that are relevant for implementing carbon markets at the domestic level. And finally, we will have some other considerations that are relevant to mobilizing climate finance for mitigation and adaptation outcomes. Thank you both, Emily, Carol, for joining this webinar and to really, to start kicking us off on thinking about some of the background. What should we understand nowadays by carbon markets? Carol.
Thank you, Olivia. Well, carbon markets are a broad concept that encompasses both compliance systems and voluntary markets. Under compliance carbon markets, we have regulated entities that have legal obligations related to their greenhouse gas emissions that they can comply with by buying carbon emissions allowances or carbon credits. And conversely, in a voluntary market, these entities have no explicit obligation in terms of their greenhouse gas emissions, but they can voluntarily buy carbon credits to offset their own carbon emissions or as part of their corporate social responsibility strategies. Yes, indeed, the Kyoto Protocol was a compliance system to the extent that developed countries had legal obligations to limit their greenhouse gas emissions, and they could use carbon allowances or carbon offsets issued under the Kyoto Protocol's three market instruments. And now that developed countries no longer have any mitigation obligations under the Kyoto Protocol, this compliance system particularly is no longer operational. Like the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement also offers market instruments for parties to use to meet their targets, their NDCs. Market instruments are designed as options for what we call a cooperative implementation between the parties, for parties to cooperate with each other to achieve their NDCs in the most cost-efficient way.
Something that I want to ask Emily at this stage is, when we're talking about carbon markets, often, the focus is on carbon and therefore on mitigation of carbon. So mitigation outcomes, I think, is kind of the overarching term that is used nowadays for essentially credits, outcomes that have achieved some kind of removal, reduction, or avoidance of carbon or carbon equivalent greenhouse gases. But is it solely that the system is focusing on mitigation outcomes, or are there other considerations and potential benefits?
It's important to step back and remember that Article 6 is a creature of the Paris Agreement, which has more holistic goals and aims, and certainly human rights and the rights of Indigenous communities and minorities, and doing no harm to the environment, and there are a number of considerations that go through integrity principles that have been very well debated in the halls of the Article 6 negotiations. There are other considerations and other sort of requirements. It's not purely about the science and about a greenhouse gas emissions reduction. There are other considerations that get taken into account. That said, I think what we've seen, and I digress slightly here into sort of the territory of Article 6.8 and non-market approaches and how the marketplace is evolving internationally, is that there is a desire, I think, among private sector, typically on voluntary markets, but among the private sector, to want to purchase carbon credits from projects that have a holistic story and a holistic outcome. So it's not just about a greenhouse gas emissions reduction, it's about demonstrating livelihood benefits or other benefits to productive land use, or about other benefits to the environment and biodiversity, or about other benefits to Indigenous communities. There's a raft of additional benefits that are now coming into relevance, I think.
And now that we have these background and these helpful considerations, perhaps what would be useful is to think about what are some of the drivers of investments in carbon markets.
I think it goes to the point Carol made at the outset around sort of a compliance motivation or a voluntary motivation. I think I completely understand, and I think we all understand where voluntary market and compliance market has come from as a description, but I think nowadays it's more accurate to frame that as somebody's motivation for participating in a market rather than a particular marketplace. And I think really that's what drives investment and purchasing in the private sector context, is that there is a requirement, a statutory or legal requirement or a commitment that is binding, that has been made, that therefore there needs to be transfers of emissions reductions in order to meet that compliance requirement, such as a liability under an emissions cap or a tax or a pricing scheme. And then voluntarily, I think the motivations have historically been very broad, but increasingly now there is such an emphasis on environment, social governance and ESG type imperatives, and as well as assessment and disclosure and reporting frameworks, that is raising a lot of awareness around environmental and greenhouse gas emissions footprints of various businesses not just directly, but supply and value chain as well. And so there's a really complicated, I think, purchasing and driver emerging, as well as to whether what has historically been a pattern of offsetting and purchasing carbon credits for what's called offsetting to offset the emission or the exceedance and bring back to a point of neutrality or reduction by retiring carbon credits, now to almost investment and what's called insetting. So sort of keeping the carbon credits and retiring them, or thinking about stapling them to products or brands or services in order to decarbonize, or to not decarbonize because it involves credits, but in order to create neutrality across value and supply chains. So there's a very complex motivation, I think, coming through on the private sector, but it is the other thing that is growing in awareness is what has been a traditional environmental hierarchy of sort of avoiding and mitigating before offsetting impacts. And I think we're starting to see that now more, certainly in the global north, in terms of looking at trying to decarbonize as a first measure, and then look at mitigation and offsetting as sort of second and third options for various emitting entities and facilities.
If I can add to what Emily just said, and I completely agree. It's I think that also the perspective from investors. I think there's a growing awareness from the financial market since the Paris Agreement, at least, with that initiative called the Task Force for Climate Financial Disclosures that was enacted as a means to clarify the information that is provided by companies, by organizations in terms of their financial risks associated with climate change. And I think this has certainly been growing in terms of the awareness, and also the development of the tools to address these risks, to identify these risks and address them. And this has also been more catching the attention of these players, mostly due to the also trends in terms of climate litigation. So we're seeing more and more lawsuits all over the world, even against corporations, to claim either more climate action, or to challenge companies' lack of disclosure, or insufficient disclosure, or even to claim for compensation from loss and damage related to climate change. So I think there are drivers also for the financial market to be more aware about these risks, and be willing to identify these risks and address them in their investment decisions as well. I wanted to flag also that we do have an important signal coming out from the Paris Agreement in Article 4.1, which is basically the article that refers somehow to what we're calling today the net zero commitments, because there is a roadmap provided by Article 4.1 on how countries can promote mitigation to achieve the Paris Agreement's objective of limiting the global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. And I think this is very relevant to corporate action outside the Paris Agreement. We can see how this concept of net zero targets was really captured from the Paris Agreement, and was further elaborated and evolved through other initiatives outside the Paris Agreement.
And I think it is a pleasing thing to see now that, if I can use the phrase, that there appears to be a race to the top rather than a race to the bottom because of some of these complementary disclosure frameworks and this growing awareness and our ability, as it's correct to do, to sort of interrogate and look at what we've done before and try and improve on that. And I think that continuous improvement is coming through as well. And so I think there are different tools in the toolbox in that certainly regulation and incentives both play their role, and that's where market mechanisms come from. But there are also other pathways for investment and finance, and I think that's where some of the disclosure frameworks and some of these parallel initiatives and the really interesting point that Carol just made around Article 4.1 as well, I think if finance and growth and investment is not going to involve the trading of an emissions reduction unit, but may still use accounting frameworks to demonstrate impact or communicate impact, then there are avenues through sort of certainly Article 6.8 potentially to capture some of those things, but also those broader disclosure frameworks.
With this helpful background, let's delve into the cooperative approaches that are set out in Article 6 of that agreement. These are cooperative approaches which parties to the Paris Agreement can engage in voluntarily. And I'd like to turn to each in turn. And so starting with what is called the Article 6.2 cooperative approach, Emily, and broadly, what is this approach and how does it operate?
Yeah, thank you, Olivia. I think I will probably give a general overview because I think the UNFCCC has done some really good work in unpacking the detail of each element of Article 6. So I certainly encourage people. There are some good material slides as well as videos that can be watched to better understand the detail. So I will stay away from the detail here, but in essence, Article 6.2 it establishes a framework for the international transfer of mitigation outcomes, as you mentioned. These things we hear as ITMOs stands for Internationally Transferred Mitigation Outcomes, and it's a particular cooperative approach between parties, so country parties, that involves the creation, transfer, and use of ITMOs, either towards an NDC or for other international mitigation purposes or other mitigation purposes. And it encourages and facilitates parties coming together bilaterally or multilaterally to agree on how they may transfer ITMOs, which party will benefit, how corresponding adjustments and accounting will be addressed, and to set some rules. And I think it's really important to note that the guidance that the parties have been working very hard on in the negotiations at the COPs has been very important. It's in many respects, unlike Article 6.4, which Carol will talk about shortly. Article 6.2 could be used quite quickly, technically, under the Paris Agreement because it didn't require the establishment of additional rules and bodies to oversee it. Parties have agreed it is useful to have broader guidance and more detailed guidance around the use of Article 6.2, and that's largely to ensure that there is transparency and accountability in relation to the use and the reporting and the accounting of these internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, which country will use them to report against their NDC, how that will be accounted and reported through in a transparent way. The thing that I like about the Article 6.2 arrangements is that it has this framework and guidance, but it is then negotiated directly between parties that are participating in a particular arrangement. And to that end, certainly what we've seen so far from, in particular, the Swiss examples. So Switzerland has been very active in negotiating various arrangements going towards Article 6.2. Is that the parties themselves, through those negotiations, they can go above and beyond the guidance it's up to them, and we've started to see.
The other cooperative approach that also involves a market mechanism, a so-called market mechanism, is under Article 6.4. So Carol, perhaps if you can just briefly describe this and highlight, how it differs from Article 6.2, or, how is it linked to it as well? Thanks.
Well, Article 6.4 basically is a mechanism that certifies greenhouse gas mitigation units based on activities and methodologies that either reduce emissions or remove emissions based on a baseline of projected emissions. And unlike the Article 6.2 that is negotiated between the parties, as Emily mentioned, projects proposed under Article 6.4, this mechanism, can be put forward by private parties as well. So I guess this is the main difference between the two instruments, is that one is necessarily a cooperation between countries that are parties to the Paris Agreement, while 6.4 is an instrument that can be accessed by private parties, although the projects proposed by these private parties need to be approved by national authorities that are parties to the Paris Agreement. And the units generated under this mechanism can be used by parties to meet their targets in the Paris Agreement. Of course, this is the main purpose of this mechanism, but it can also be used for other international mitigation purposes, such as international schemes like the ICAO's International Aviation Emissions Scheme, CORSIA. And it can be used for other purposes generally described that could include domestic implementation. And I think perhaps another thing to mention here is that one thing that was recently decided, and I think it's important to clarify, is that there is a distinction, a clear label even for these units whenever they are not used for, let's say, Paris compliance purposes. But the thing to note here is that whenever a unit is used for a Paris compliance purpose, it is going to be considered an ITMO, an internationally transferred mitigation outcome, and so it automatically sort of is transferred to the Article 6.2 system. We can say that the ITMO is the sole mitigation unit of the Paris Agreement for compliance with the Paris Agreement. The transfer of these units must be correspondingly adjusted in their emissions balances and reports they are going to submit to the Paris Agreement's transparency framework, to avoid, of course, double counting of these units in both parties' NDCs balances. The other one is to be used for other purposes, and it's called the mitigation contribution unit. And in this case, of course, the mitigation contribution unit does not have to be subject to a corresponding adjustment between both countries' NDCs, because it's going to be used for something else that is not for compliance with the parties' NDC.
The negotiations are still ongoing, certainly on Article 6.4 and on the other items as well. But so, when do you expect Article 6.4 and the ability to, generate these credits, for the mechanism to generate these credits and for trading to start?
Yes, it seems that the mechanism will not become fully operational before 2025, at least.
my understanding is similar, that there is a tail that will probably stretch to around 2025, if at the earliest, probably, but fully operational. Like it's, yeah.
And there is a third cooperative approach that doesn't get as much airtime than the other two, and this is a non-market approach. So this is under Article 6.8, and it is useful to mention in the context of this webinar, because it is another approach that a country could embark on, as well as, or just, instead of carbon markets, in order to raise climate finance. So, briefly, what is this approach, and sort of what is its potential?
One thing to mention before starting is that, because I'm not sure we mentioned this before, is that in general, cooperation under Article 6 is in 6.2, 6.4, and 6.8. In any case, it's supposed to enhance implementation and enable parties to promote more mitigation action. So by cooperating with each other, parties can do more. They can raise their mitigation ambition. So this is supposed to be an ambition or an approach to promote more ambition in many ways, even in non-market approaches. Under Article 6.8, parties can share and exchange knowledge, capacity, and resources to promote and improve mitigation and also adaptation actions in one another. And this is coupled with other various co-benefits, biodiversity, conservation, indigenous peoples protection. This is, I think, a very unique instrument still that is being further designed. So there will be a web-based platform to gather all these opportunities for non-market approaches. This is still being processed by the UNFCCC Secretariat, but the purpose is for this platform to facilitate opportunities, connect parties, identify, enable them to identify, develop, and implement non-market approaches, and to record this information in the platform, so that parties will be able to showcase existing initiatives, and parties that are seeking support will be able to identify these existing opportunities in this platform. There are also other resources that this platform will provide. There will be research tools, visualization tools for this existing on-market approaches, and also outside these sort of online platform, there will be a discussion forum for parties to facilitate networking among the users of the platform, so that they can identify synergies and potential for matching their, let's say, supply and demand in terms of mitigation and adaptation actions.
I think the only comment that I personally am quite excited and think there is significant potential in relation to the implementation, the full implementation of Article 6.8 as it evolves, because I note markets, as we've spoken about, are one tool to mobilise and facilitate finance, but there are others, and I think the Article 6.8 framework and the fact that it plugs into the Paris Agreement as a whole, and mechanisms such as the transparency framework and potential for reporting or some degree of transparency around activities to be included, not just through the platforms that Carol mentioned, but perhaps ultimately even through biennial transparency reports, means that I think there's going to be a lot of interest, particularly because this article, again, Article 6.8, references the public and private sector participation. I think the private sector will be very interested in some of the more holistic outcomes that can be achieved through mutual participation that's not unitized and doesn't involve the transfer of a carbon credit, but does involve other forms of finance or outcome-based arrangements.
Very pleased to have you both and to have this discussion, which is really the crux of the webinar today, thinking about what considerations countries that are thinking of developing, carbon market frameworks should be taking into account.
If you compare, for instance, Article 6 and what used to be the Clean Development Mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol, so under the Clean Development Mechanism, which we call the CDM, host countries did not have so much extensive obligations that they have now under Article 6. And under Article 6, this ranges from making strategic decisions to ensure that their participation in Article 6 does not compromise their NDC achievement. This also comes with the obligation of putting up in place very significant regulatory, institutional, as well as infrastructure requirements. So this is a lot of resources, a lot of time, a lot of capacity required of host countries to be able to put all this in place. And to look at the cost of putting all this in place vis-a-vis what you're going to get in the country. So I think this is a very key consideration for host countries to start thinking, what is the cost? What is the requirements? What do I need to put in place to be able to implement Article 6 vis-a-vis what are the benefits coming from it?
It's probably worth recapping that the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which sets out essentially market-based approaches, but also a non-market-based approach, does have participation requirements. So there are baseline requirements that countries need to meet in order to be able to participate. I probably won't go into too much detail about Article 6 requirements in that discussion, because I think in the context of markets, there is a direct approach, and that is participating through Article 6, and the link there is that countries can elect to participate in order to increase their ambition or try and achieve NDCs, and over time hopefully become more ambitious because they can participate in markets to help achieve their NDCs as well. So in that sense, there is a direct link there, but there's also the ability, and I think here from Australia, and it's only one example, but Australia has a domestic unlinked emissions trading scheme or carbon market that actually is part of its own domestic policies and laws in order to drive emissions down as part of its NDC. So there's two ways that carbon markets can operate in an NDC context. One is within the domestic country, within the laws and policies and controls that it sets for itself, and how it achieves its own NDC targets in that sovereign context, and then also the participation through international linking and marketplace under Article 6.
Lydia, did you want to add something on this?
In terms of whether countries can participate in Article 6.2 or Article 6.4, I think Emily has already provided this overview of how Article 6 provides a framework for countries to voluntarily cooperate in implementing their NDC, while they're also increasing ambition and promoting sustainable development goals. So basically, every party to the Paris Agreement can participate in the market mechanism under Article 6.4 and 6.2. But then it comes with a lot of responsibilities, and I think we'll discuss this later on, but it comes with a lot of responsibilities for host countries. So if you want to participate, you have to comply with the Article 6 participation requirements, which includes putting in place extensive frameworks to allow you to participate, frameworks for authorizations of what we call international internationally transferred mitigation outcomes. So while countries are at liberty to participate in Article 6 and to decide whether they want to participate or not, there are certain requirements that they need to comply with, and there are certain participation requirements that they need to comply with. And as I mentioned, Article 6 comes with certain extensive obligations for host countries.
Perhaps, for some of the audience that might not be so clear on what is the link between a country's NDC and a potential carbon market framework that it might envisage. Can we highlight perhaps some of the links and things to think about in that context, Lydia?
So just to take a step back, if we think about the NDCs, basically what they do is to set out a country's mitigation and adaptation goals, which are based on national circumstances. So basically the NDC would also provide an indication on what kind of financing is needed to implement this mitigation and adaptation goals. And carbon markets can come in as one of the instruments to implement this or to finance this mitigation and adaptation goals in the NDC. What we see that a carbon market framework would do is to provide the mechanics or how actually carbon markets will be used to raise finance to implement these goals that have been set out in the NDC. And if we look at, for instance, Article 6 specific frameworks or frameworks that have been set up by countries on Article 6, we see how countries directly link this carbon market framework and the NDC. And how they do this is, for instance, by using NDC sectors to determine the kind of mitigation activities that can be implemented or transacted under Article 6. So you see, for instance, if you look at Ghana's Article 6 framework, or if you look at Vanuatu's Article 6 framework, they decide that only activities in the conditional part of the NDC can be transacted under Article 6. And if certain activities are in the unconditional part of the NDC, then these mitigation outcomes from these activities cannot be transacted under Article 6 because they intend to use it for their own domestic targets. So you see how countries are directly linking their NDCs to their carbon market frameworks by linking the mitigation outcomes that can be transacted to the NDC sectors.
And just to come back to something that Lydia mentioned there, that some countries might decide that only the conditional parts of their NDCs, when projects relate to these are the ones that are going to be transacted internationally. What is the consideration behind that? Why do countries need to make this distinction?
So basically, when countries decide what is conditional is that they will implement certain activities subject to receiving international finance or technology support or capacity support. And then, so this means that carbon markets could be one source of the financing to implement this conditional part of the NDC.
Yes, and so on the reverse of that coin, when they might develop carbon market projects that relate to the unconditional part of the NDC, what does that mean in practice?
So what it means in practice is that what is unconditional is what they promised to implement using their domestic budget or domestic sources of finance. So what this would mean in terms of Article 6 framework, then it would mean that this type of the mitigation outcomes from these activities, we cannot transfer them to another country or to the NDC of another country, but we want to count them towards our own NDC. So this is how they include this in their frameworks.
And so I think this kind of neatly takes us into thinking about or discussing some of the potential risks for host countries.
I think we've gone towards the risks, and I think Lydia and yourself there, Olivia, have highlighted one, which is I think considering and having frameworks in place around, particularly with carbon markets. I completely agree that carbon markets can assist with the conditional parts of NDC, but also main parts of NDC as well, if it's tied to renewable energy. And one way to raise the finance for renewable energy may be to host the new renewable energy facility, but to allow investors from other countries to take or claim the credit, and that can be a market mechanism that helps to contribute to development in a host country that's going to be useful for the domestic population. But certainly one thing I think that is really worth commenting and calling out is I think sometimes that the oversight and the governance that's required, particularly where there could be both regulatory activities and emissions reductions that a country intends to claim through its NDC and to account for in its NDC that it will do, as well as then elements and making sure there's some oversight or some ability to spot and record where there could be voluntary carbon market activity, because it throws up an area where there needs to be quite strong oversight and potentially registries that record both host carbon projects that may go towards the host country's NDC, or where there has been an agreed ITMO for use into another country's NDC, but then also making sure there's no double counting or no double claiming of things that might be in the grey voluntary market space, which I know this is something that's a very active consideration for a lot of countries, and how to make sure if there are voluntary carbon market projects that exist or have been there for a few years, that they are calculated, they are considered as part of what can and can't then qualify and be reported through the NDC process as well.
Lydia, in some of the frameworks that you have been working on, have you seen, how this might be tackled? This risk, because a country might be both considering the voluntary carbon markets and the carbon markets under Paris Agreement?
I think conceptually, it's quite an issue for debate, because there are few people who say that voluntary carbon market credits should be as well authorized if they're going to be used even by private buyers for their own voluntary commitments. But then certain people or some countries are saying, hey, if these are just voluntary carbon market credits that are going to be used by private entities for their own individual or voluntary claims, then we should not apply what we call corresponding adjustments, and we should be allowed to use this to report in our NDC. So conceptually, it's a very, very difficult discussion. But what I see countries have done, at least the ones that already have Article 6 frameworks, and we always go back to Ghana, which allows voluntary carbon market activities to be implemented in parallel to Article 6. And they say that if you are developing a VCM project, but you'd like to request for what we call authorization, then you can come and request for authorization, and then corresponding adjustment will be applied, and we will not use this in our NDC. But if you just want to sell your VCM credits to an individual or an entity that is using it for voluntary purposes, even if it's internationally, you do not require authorization. We will not apply corresponding adjustments, but we will use those emission reductions in our NDC.
And I think the important thing with that is that the purchasers will make decisions as well. So there's that consideration to balance for the countries implementing these frameworks and which pathway they will take, and they are completely open to take those pathways as the rules of the Paris Agreement allow them to. But then I think what we're finding now in the voluntary carbon market is a very quick transition towards high quality, high integrity credits, and a consciousness in purchasers around where credits have come from and how they've been used or treated, or how they may be used and treated with respect to compliance processes or NDC reporting or broader reporting as well. So I think it's going to be a very interesting, particularly the next couple of years, as the rules kind of slowly get more and more detailed and finalised under Article 6, but also as the voluntary market and Corsia and other marketplaces start to really settle into where they're going to sit and how they interrelate. You summarised really well, and it is this the benefits, the cost benefit assessment, I think, is a very important point to note, and it is, I think, trying to take a step back and think about the opportunity that a country is trying to create a pathway for, or the problem it is trying to solve when it comes to whether or not a market is the best approach to realise that opportunity or to solve that problem. And it's a very important decision and process to work through, because yes, there is a lot involved.
And so if a country has decided that, looking at its priorities and circumstances, it does want to implement a carbon market framework, and thinking of countries that don't have experience of the previous mechanisms under the Kyoto Protocol in particular, there has been mention already of a lot of infrastructure and different approaches that are needed. But what are some of these key, I think sometimes are referred to as readiness considerations?
I'll put to one side the particular requirements of Article 6, because they need to be met. That's a given. But then in terms of working through how that translates into a more domestic framework, certainly I think thought has to be given to how to create a very clear and certain and also, I think importantly, predictable arrangements that will support investment and accountability. So what are the principles, the policies, the reporting that's required, and the data and review that's going to be needed? Who's going to do it? How will that be resourced? There's a lot that needs to be thought about. And I think knowing that, certainly in work that we've done, including with LRI, it is looking at whether or not you can leverage and use existing standards and processes to start with, but putting in place local controls and local decision making to make it more fit for purpose, and then grow that over time. And I think the World Bank has done some good work looking at how that sort of reliance spectrum can move across time. It could be very heavy reliance on some existing voluntary carbon market standards and methodologies in order to look at carbon credits. And this is sort of more broadly, it's outside Article 6. But if there is a compliance scheme or a governance framework that a country wants to establish, does it need to create its own crediting and its own methodologies and the like? Not necessarily, because Article 6.4 will provide a lot of them if the marketplace ends up being Article 6.4, provided those requirements are met. Article 6.2 will probably borrow, I suspect, a lot of the methodologies and the requirements for a marketplace to have the science and integrity and the measuring and verification and quantification requirements that are required to issue and transfer credits or mitigation outcomes. But some may borrow from more credible standards that already exist. And so there is this ability to look around and borrow from things that already exist, but to put local controls on top of it. And I think that does require laws and policies and institutional arrangements, which Lydia mentioned as well. Certainly the authorisation framework is quite intensive. And then I think the assurance piece is the other part. The reporting requirements that form part of that, but housing and understanding how the registry will operate and the information that needs to be recorded in various registries domestically, and then in reporting for the international purposes as well, and looking at when there may be authorisation for use towards other NDCs and corresponding adjustments that need to be made. That involves quite detailed accounting, and therefore inventories and accounting and building those accounts needs to happen, and that can often be a difficult starting point for a lot of countries who haven't built some of these accounts previously. There may be data out there, but bringing it together in a cohesive way to support a carbon market participation can be quite a task. So there's the legal infrastructure, and then a number of practical considerations, which then leads to resourcing considerations as well.
So one of the key issues is just, again, the strategic decisions on eligibility criteria for mitigation outcomes, which basically means as a country, before you develop your own framework, you need to decide which activities from mitigation outcomes from which activities am I willing to authorize under Article 6 without compromising my NDC achievement, which ones am I not willing to do this. So this kind of strategic decisions need to be made. And then once it's made, then they translate this into what they call eligibility criteria within their legal frameworks, where they can decide they have a list of activities which can be authorized, but also a list of activities which are a no-go zone for the country.
I think part of it is a long-term view that needs to be taken, because some of these projects, I mean, permanence is a key requirement. So that strategic choice and that strategic consideration, and Lydia mentioned, I think is very relevant, because there could be a forest-rich country that may be net negative at a point in time, but if those strategic considerations are not thought about in a sort of a short, medium, and longer term time horizon, sometimes it can go awry. And future NDCs and how ambitious you can become, I think those things are worth thinking about as well. That's helping us all achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement ultimately.
As a result of what you've been saying, you know, I can hear that there is a lot of planning work and a lot of strategic work. And then once you've taken some initial decisions, further work that needs to be done in terms of, you know, how you go about implementing those strategic decisions. At the same time, I'm hearing this, I hear also from some of the beneficiaries of LRI that they are under this hurry to, you know, quickly come up with a carbon market framework. And I wanted to tease out a little bit what your views are in terms of whether there is really such a need to hurry up and, you know, be first in line.
Yes, I think it's a very live consideration, because carbon markets are a very popular consideration, and they are evolving so quickly, and the urgency is there globally for us to act. And in many cases, there is a saying that we try and use every tool in the toolbox. So I think countries are wanting to try and use every tool in the toolbox, and carbon markets are one of those tools. So certainly I think there is a lot of urgency about some countries' consideration of carbon markets. And I think while it is tempting and there is urgency, there is also time. And certainly taking that step back to think about, again, what is the opportunity that we're trying to capture and harness and realize, or what is the problem we are trying to solve? Is a carbon market actually in the short to medium term the best answer, or do we work more slowly on a carbon market and look at a couple of other things that are going to be more achievable in a short to medium sense that still have impact? And I think that will differ from country to country and place to place depending on circumstance. But certainly I encourage people just to try and take that deep breath and think about what they are trying to achieve. If it is to attract new development and renewable energy, then there are different considerations to looking at being a net exporter of carbon credits and what that might mean as well if there's no targeting for renewable energy or other kind of clean development. So I think it really does depend, and sometimes there are more traditional ways to reach the same end, like sort of carbon pricing and taxation and other tools in the short to medium term that can achieve a similar outcome, while a carbon market is well designed and well thought through.
I completely agree with Emily that there needs to be some thinking that goes through this, and countries need to take some time on this. But I'm just thinking when we talk about a carbon market framework and just moving beyond Article 6, but also thinking of other markets like the VCM, I understand where a lot of these countries are coming from. So the VCM, for instance, the voluntary carbon market has been active for quite some time without government involvement in a lot of countries. And recently, and even, for quite some time, there've been a lot of criticism on voluntary carbon market projects and carbon markets generally, on how benefits are shared with communities, on how some of these projects are implemented, on the integrity of the credits, on whether they actually reduce emission reductions or not. And because of a lot of these complaints, a lot of governments are feeling the pressure. And because of this pressure, there's this rush to regulate the market. It could be Article 6, it could be just the voluntary carbon markets. And we see this rush to regulate the market because of this complaints that we've seen for a long time, or criticism on the carbon market. And I think this is where we see a lot of countries coming up with, benefit sharing schemes. A lot of them, some of them have been criticized for wanting to take too much from what the project developers get. But also we see that for a long time, project developers have been developing projects without having benefits to the communities. So there's a lot of balancing that's going on. And also it's good to understand where this background or the rush is coming from. And this is where one of it is coming from. And I think this is something that needs to be addressed as fast as it could be, to just make sure that as much as we have the carbon markets, the right people are benefiting, but also there's integrity to it. And then also we have Article 6 that comes in, and some countries are getting approached by other donors or even by private sector buyers, and they're like, oh, there's probability of getting there's possibility of getting some money here. How do we tap into this? And thinking, how do they tap into this? And then they try to come up with regulations or frameworks as fast as possible. And some of them are not well thought out if they're rushed. So I think for countries, it would be important that this is really thought out. But one approach that I see countries are taking to this extent is coming up with some kind of an interim guideline, So like we saw Zambia, for instance, they came up with an interim guidelines on how projects can, or how activities can participate in Article 6. And for this, it's just something temporary that says, for the next, I don't know, whatever amount of time, or in the interim, we will only approve activity 1, 2, 3, 4 to be developed under Article 6. And this is what we will authorize. In the interim, we will use an existing institution to provide this authorization process. But we are doing this as in the background, we are thinking of the long-term strategy. And once they make these decisions, then they come up with something long-term, more of a regulatory framework, more of a legislation, whatever they decide to, and now have this in place. So I think this could also be an approach to tap into this opportunity, but also taking the time to think through.
I think I really agree with that when you can step back, I think everybody, we can see it doesn't have to be either or, that there are sometimes steps that you can take to take advantage of certain opportunities, but actually also give yourself the time to think things through in the long term. I like what you have relayed there, Lydia. I think it's a really important point.
This section, there's so much more that we could be talking about in terms of, depending on the feedback and demand that we get, we might come back to this at some point in the future. Looking up a few statistics before this, and apparently only 7% of investment goes to adaptation globally, which is remarkable when you consider the year we've had with climate change manifesting in so many ways across the world. I think that in fact the adaptation outcomes are integrated in a number of existing carbon projects, probably more than we realize. And certainly we're seeing that sort of being framed in that way also. So, I mean, giving thought to a lot of agroforestry projects, for example. Mangroves is another adaptation. You're preventing soil erosion in a lot of agroforestry projects. Mangroves, of course, preventing coastal erosion. And then we're seeing a reframing of a lot of carbon projects towards things like soil, as opposed to talking about them like sort of biochar. So I think that's built in already in some projects. There's definitely not enough done though. And that's where I think the private sector has a huge opportunity. And I would say the private sector is already seizing this opportunity. I mean, if you look at some of the massive companies out there that are working on and monetizing irrigation projects, for example, again, rainwater harvesting is another, and then innovative technologies such as floating cities, new building materials that are all helping with adaptation. So again, I don't necessarily think it'll all be through carbon markets or adaptation funds. I think there will be a huge private sector component to that as well.
Yeah, look, I completely agree. And I think when we think about adaptation, there's such a spectrum as well. And I agree with Anna's observation that I think here in Australia, we have a thriving domestic carbon market that has attracted premium prices for co-benefits. So other verifiable improvements to biodiversity or local livelihoods, Indigenous communities, including through employment, protection of cultural values, cultural sites, those sorts of activities alongside a carbon project, particularly in the land sector. And so I think there's those types of adaptation benefits. And then I think the spectrum goes all the way through to sort of crisis point. And the difficulty, I think, historically, and it is a surprising figure that you mentioned, Anna, about 7%. It has, I think, historically been a place that's difficult to attract finance because of the funding cycles and return cycles, and the fact that so many disasters are generally slow onset, or some of the adaptation crises are slow onset. However, sadly, we're seeing them with more rapid onset these days. But there is so much opportunity here, I think, in terms of adaptation funding and adaptation investment. And thankfully, I think the financial sector as a whole is starting to really look at better ways to deliver finance, including through blended finance and multilateral development bank vehicles as well.
If we delve a little bit more into what some of these opportunities for financing adaptation outcomes might be outside of the carbon markets, what would be some of the examples you'd highlight?
I think one that I'd mention is probably, and we may come back to this as well, but I certainly think there are a few touch points throughout the Paris Agreement and under the UNFCCC more broadly, the convention itself, that assist the adaptation fund for one, and a number of vehicles that assist in attempting to send finance where it needs to go in terms of some of these adaptation responses. Certainly, the leveraging of share of proceeds through carbon markets and sort of taking levies across carbon markets and redeploying that into an adaptation space are other initiatives. But I mean, the one that I can think of where there is a natural home for, I think, quite a large opportunity to quite transparently report on verifiable and measurable adaptation outcomes that are blended with mitigation is Article 6.8. Now, obviously, that won't be well suited where something is purely a carbon project and there are units that people want to trade associated with sort of an Article 6 or a financial investment. But there are countless examples, I think, of delivering climate finance in ways that are not unitized and don't involve trading of carbon credits or emission reduction units, that can still use accounting frameworks to provide a clear and transparent measure of benefit and therefore lend itself to being reported through Article 6.8.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with Emily. And I think when we see Article 6.4 emissions reductions units coming on stream in the next year or so, I mean, that there's 5% of those. I'm sure many people listening to this webinar will know that, but that's the minimum amount that will have to be put into the adaptation fund. So that's a clear target already, which doesn't exist at the moment. And then in terms of the sort of the non-market mechanisms, I think you're talking, I mean, Article 6.8 is as yet kind of still in the early stages, but it's sort of everything that is in market, right? So I mean, you're talking about you're talking about a huge possibility of whether it's results-based financing or other mechanisms. I think a lot of it will be, as Emily said, driven by the increased disclosure and reporting requirements that are coming in, including TNFD, which will be really interesting to see. And adaptation is also tracked into the global biodiversity framework.
It raises, I think, a huge opportunity and an important confluence, but also a potential headache, because when we think about concepts like additionality and baselining, and if you are primarily doing something for a carbon project, but it actually has biodiversity, we want these things to compound and assist each other, not sort of nullify and result in double claiming or double counting under two different conventions for the same activity. It's sort of, I think there will need to be thought given how they interrelate and how we create systems so that we can transparently track and trace and make sure each activity and each gain or each preservation of a natural reservoir is happening for a reason that is being appropriately attributed, I think is going to be a really important consideration. And juggling that across two conventions, I mean, thankfully their genesis is back at the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. So there's a little bit of history that sort of has led to these parallel conventions, but nonetheless they are still separate conventions with separate processes and requirements and party-driven processes. So I absolutely can see the touch points, and I can see the evolution, and probably I think we'll see under the Convention for Biodiversity quite a rapid evolution of market mechanisms, because the world has learnt through the carbon experience around how market mechanisms can be continuously improved over time.
What we're seeing is the big players coming out now with consultations. So Plan Vivo, Avera have both consultations underway. The SD Vista had a really good webinar there recently about what they're going to do about their methodology for nature credits. And I think, to your point, Emily, what they're really focusing on is sort of the stacking of biodiversity and carbon. So they're really kind of trying to untangle how do you balance these sort of anticipated outcomes and the various metrics. But I mean, this is what call it. Yeah, I mean, I have heard skepticism in some quarters that if we can't even get carbon right, how can we get biodiversity right? If you say, okay, we're going to look after these elephants, or this species of tree, how do you know that you're not negatively impacting the remainder of the ecosystem around that tree or that animal?
I have no doubt that we can solve it, and hopefully solve it quickly, but it's going to require, I think, solving and working through. I don't want to descend too much into a legal discussion, but certainly the interactions with property law and other rights when we're dealing with things that are affixed to the land or what have you. And again, carbon has solved some of this in different places, but I think sort of nature brings in, I think, quite a really interesting balance and strategic thought that needs to go into the realm of public and private, and public interest and private interest as well.
And I think it's important that countries look at alternatives to meeting their NDCs to just the market mechanisms. Because what we're certainly hearing is that, and I mean, obviously the price for carbon credits on the voluntary market has tanked this year for various reasons, including the sort of reputational allegations and things that have come out. But countries in the global south that will be typically exporting ITMOs and credits under Article 6.2, potentially Article 6.4, the risk is that they'll be doing so at a very low price, and selling correspondingly adjusted units that they will have to then add back in to their NDCs. So they risk still having challenges to meet their NDCs when they've, I suppose, exported those ITMOs at a low price. So I think it's important that they can attract finance through other mechanisms and consider those other mechanisms, so that they can help meet their NDCs without relying on the market.
It's also where I see Article 6.8 starting to become relevant, because there are accounting frameworks, there are environmental accounting frameworks, there are various ways to account for and measure things. It may require more effort, but there's also a degree of freedom in the biennial reports and the transparency framework under the Paris Agreement, where countries have an opportunity to report on their use of various mechanisms, Article 6, and it's sort of not yet as rigid. So I think there are opportunities for some of the existing pathways to start to find a home and evolve some of these things in almost a live testing ground, so that we can then improve it over time. And I think there has to be balance across Article 6, and all parties continually mention that in the negotiation halls, and it is an important feature of the multilateral process. And therefore, I think that the progress and the fact that Article 6.8 is still at an early point is actually useful, because some of these things can be piloted and tested and talked about and unpacked, and looking at whether or not integrated land management outcomes and agroforestry, as Anna mentioned, and sort of fishery type activities that are complex and involve multiple sort of measurables as well as potential mitigation, things that are perhaps not suited well to carbon crediting, such as the the protection of natural sinks and sort of the avoided destruction of natural sinks and oceans and the like. I think there's a real opportunity to look at how those bespoke types of examples on a scale that still attracts investment can be reported or piloted through Article 6.8.
I hope you found the webinar engaging and informative. And I now want to offer some thoughts by way of conclusions. So whether it's to engage in carbon markets or not, it should be a part of a country's strategic long-term decision. And if it chooses to do so, it will have to develop regulatory and institutional frameworks as well as infrastructure. This will in turn require time and capacity. For some, a useful first step might be to use existing standards and methodologies, of course, adapting them to the local context. There was also the approach taken by the government of Zambia, which was mentioned, whereby the government there has issued interim carbon market guidelines while it works on its Climate Change Act, which will provide for the regulation of the carbon market in Zambia. We have also heard that globally, only 7% of climate investments go towards adaptation outcomes. Further resources from LRI and others on this topic are referenced in the description of the YouTube video and on the LRI's website where this video appears. If this webinar raises any legal questions that you would like to discuss, please get in touch at inquiries@legalresponse.org.